Great Pyramids, some of the wonders of the world. They've been there for thousands of years. You're highly familiar with them. You, if you're old enough, remember King Tut's museum tour of the late 70s and early 80s. But have you asked yourself, how exactly did they build the pyramid? I mean, they just cut a bunch of stone and put them in a pyramid shape. But how'd they do that with no electricity or hydraulics thousands of years ago? And why are they still there? Pretty much unchanged after thousands of years. It's kind of an amazing architectural and engineering feat, isn't it? How did they pull that off, that ancient civilization? We're not exactly sure, is the truth. Randall Carlson has some ideas about this, and he's qualified to have them. He's an architect, a master builder, a geometrician, an explorer, and a scholar. And he's been taking a very close look at the pyramids and also other ancient structures around the world, and asking questions about how they got there and what their existence means for the rest of us. Very interesting person with a very interesting perspective joining us now for the next hour. Randall Carlson. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Great to see you.
Yes. Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So very few people get to a place in life where they can consider an expert on the construction of the pyramids. How did you get to this place in life? Where are you from? What have you done? How did you get to where you are now?
Well, I'm originally from Minnesota.
Yeah.
I'm a third-generation builder. And so I started learning the building craft from my father.
Yes.
And
what kind of builder was he?
He was mostly a house builder.
Yep.
Yeah, but you know, he used a lot of geometry. He designed all of his own, built about 250 houses in his career.
Wow.
Just him and my grandfather working together. So I kind of grew up on the building sites and just started liking construction.
Was he skilled? Was he good?
Oh, he was very good. Yeah, Swedish carpenter.
Yes, the best in the world,
yeah.
if I can say.
Yeah, well, of course, it goes without saying.
It's true, great.
So I grew up, and then in the early 1970s, I was in this group, this kind of yoga meditation group, and they wanted to build back in those days, it was Buckminster Fuller Dome.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember those? Yeah.
Bucky domes, yeah.
Bucky domes, yeah. So they wanted to build a couple of Bucky domes, and nobody in the group knew how to do that. So they called on me and my two younger brothers, and we kind of spearheaded the construction of these things. But I had to get my head wrapped around all of this geometry, because this was like nothing we'd learned. I mean, I knew how to lay out a roof and enough trigonometry to figure out
the rafters, yeah.
You know, in building, it's rise over run. Everything's rise over run.
Exactly.
But you know, that's the tangent function in trigonometry. Anyway, so this was a whole different set of geometry. It was very challenging, but we kind of, you know, rose to the challenge. We built these things. I'm sure they're no longer in existence.
What were they made out of?
Well, 2x4s.
Yeah.
And then we banded them together just with 4-inch PVC pipe. We drilled cross section through and then used iron strap banding, put the whole thing together, and then plywooded it, and then put roofing on it, and that was it.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was very much fun. So then one of the domes we did, the architect that designed it after an Islamic mosque. So it came to a spire. So that was really challenging. But it was very unique, and it was featured in a national publication called Shelter, a big oversized, kind of almost magazine-like, I think recently reprinted. But so, of course, since my brothers and I built it, I had to get a copy of it. But in there, it kind of went into the history of architecture and went into some of the geometry in the background of many of these buildings and sacred structures and stuff. And this is 1973. And I found that extraordinarily fascinating. And that's kind of what led me into the geometry that they were using. And the more I got into it, the more profound it became. So this was kind of the launching, my descent into the rabbit hole initially.
But can I ask you to pause and ask, what do you mean by profound? How is geometry profound?
Well, because it links together all kinds of phenomena from the micro to the macro scale. It's complicated, and I'm soon going to be launching a whole series of, I guess you could call them classes or lectures, where I explain in detail and show the principles. But you probably heard of the Freemasons.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Okay. So now the Freemasons were the custodians of this geometry for centuries. And it goes back to the days of Plato and Pythagoras. And then obviously earlier than that, the Egyptians were very much imbued into the principles of geometry. You mentioned the Great Pyramid. There's so much, or the pyramids, there's so much we could talk about that. I'm not going to claim to know how they were built. However, there is information encoded into them that's pretty unambiguous once you work through it. It's beyond coincidence. that really points to the fact that some of these cultures in those times had more knowledge, sophisticated knowledge about the scientific workings of our world and the cosmos than they have ever been given credit for. And a lot of mainstream views are very dismissive of this idea. But the proof is in the pudding. I mean, if you work through it, it comes to the point where at what point do you go, this is beyond coincidence, you see? And the other thing that
I'm sorry, can you give us an example? So you're a builder.
Yeah.
So you would know. So
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah, you built things. Can you give us an example of a physical characteristic of the pyramids, or some characteristics of the pyramids that suggests that the people who built them had knowledge that they probably shouldn't have had 3,000 years?
The angle of the Great Pyramid, 51.84 degrees, is a very unique angle. It has a lot of, significance to it. That I think it's very difficult for me to explain. It's a lot easier for me to just show diagrams and cross sections and things like that. But one of the things is that when you go into these ancient structures, what you find is that whether you're going to Vedic culture in ancient India, whether you're going to even like the building of Gothic cathedrals, the megalithic stone structures of Northern Europe from 4,000, 5,000 years ago, even the monumental earthworks of North America, when you begin to analyze them, their dimensions, their orientation to the sky and so on, what becomes apparent is they're all working from a common template, which is really pretty remarkable.
On different continents in different
continents. Eons. Yes.
How?
This is the mystery. How? I don't know. I can't answer that, but it's there. You can show it. I've demonstrated it over and over again, how the geometry they used and how our systems of measurement are also derived from the same system of geometry. I'll give you a simple example. Two of the predominant units of measurement in ancient Egypt were the remen and the royal cubit. The very simple relationship between those is that if you draw, a remen is, it's about 1.2165 feet on a side, which is just over 14 inches. A royal cubit is just over 20, about 20.6265 inches. Now, if you draw a square that's one remen on a side, its diagonal will be a royal cubit. So right there was a fundamental geometrical relationship between the two basic units of measurement used in ancient Egypt. If you look at pictures of the pyramid, you'll see it's called the socle. The socle is a section of bedrock that was cut, and it's cut to be exactly one royal cubit in thickness, 20.6265 inches. Now, if you look at a square and its diagonal, it's irreconcilable, just like pi. Pi, you know, is an irrational number, 1.
Yes.
Yeah, 3.141592, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Okay, so the diagonal of a square is to its side in the ratio of the square root of 2 to 1. The square root of 2 is an irrational number. You cannot reconcile. So you could make the side of a square a whole number, its diagonal is now irrational, or you could make its diagonal rational and the side is irrational. However, if you go up to the next dimension and you draw one square remen, take its diagonal and use that the side of a square, which is a royal cubit, you get two square remens. So in other words, once you go from linear to area, now it's perfectly reconcilable. A square royal cubit is exactly equal to 2 square remens. Now it goes further because you can now take the so what they did now is they would take a square. Imagine this, you've got a big building site laid out. You drive in a pole that's going to be the corner of the structure. It's usually the northeast corner, because in the northern hemisphere, that was considered to be the darkest place of the building once it was finished. So you put the pole into the ground, the stake into the ground. The building grows from that. This was the philosophy behind it. It grows from that, and what you end up with is it takes form and grows. It grows from darkness into greater illumination, and that was a philosophical idea behind that. The other thing they did is they would make rectangles. So you got a rectangle that's one remen on a side. Picture it's 14.58 inches roughly. Make a rectangle. Its long side is a royal cubit. The way you would get that is you simply draw a remen on the ground, right? It's royal cubit. Now you take that as your knotted rope or your chain, whatever you're using, and you draw an arc, which is equal to the diagonal of the square. And you use that to develop a rectangle. Okay, then you take the diagonal of that rectangle, whose long side would be the square root of 2 times its short side, and you measure its diagonal, and it becomes the root 3. And that leads to the cubit that was used throughout Palestine 1,000 years later, called the Palestinian cubit.
Is that the one described in the Old Testament?
Yes.
As used to measure the ark, etc.?
Yes, yes. And to build King Solomon's temple.
Yes.
Yeah. And it goes from there. So it's a whole system of unified geometry.
And one is derived from the other?
Yes, yes. It's a whole system. And again, I'm going to be putting all of this out there. I've already put out pieces of it. So in the, I do classes and workshops and things in this where what I do is I get people, they get a big drawing pad, and I make custom compasses. They use a straight edge and a compass, and I take them step by step through the simple drawings up to the more complex drawings. And that's the way you really learn it. You can hear about it, you can be told about it, but the way you really get it in here is because by doing the drawings, it integrates mind, eye, and hand. By theirs, you get some really solid learning. So what I try to do, and then I bring in all kinds of examples, that spans, the term of history. So I go back to Egypt, I go back to Samaria, the steppes, ziggurats. I go to Angkor Wat, which Angkor Wat as
in Cambodia.
Yeah, in Cambodia, one of the vastest urban area ever in the city, right? And at the heart of that thing is a layout of a temple. There's 108 prominences on it, which is a number you find over and over and over again in these ancient traditions. And it's based on this. I show in my classes and things how it's defined precisely by this square root of 2 rectangle, where the short side is one length. You'd start with a square, lay it out on the ground, and its diagonal then gives you the length of the temple. So it's right there. It's embedded in Angkor Wat.
So I sense that there is something very profound at the heart of what you're saying.
And I'm still trying to get to what that is.
So my understanding of units of measurement was that they were relative. So like the hand is used to measure horses or whatever, right? Or a foot is about the length of your foot, etc.
Yeah.
They were derived from just common human experience. But you're suggesting, what you're explaining suggests, that there's something, that the unit of measurement is kind of inherent to nature, maybe.
Yes. Yes, I would say 100%.
So what is that?
And how did so many disparate cultures through time hit upon the
same thing? Because it could have been anything else, right? I mean, like we could decide if we were making up, like the French Revolution did, we're making up our new units of measurement.
Yeah.
And we're just gonna, the weight of this glass of water is now the basic measurement of weight.
Right. Well, the interesting thing, Tucker, is that when you get into it, there's a whole canon of numbers that become associated with the units of measurement and how they were applied to building. And those numbers have symbolic significance to these ancient cultures that used them. I mentioned that the 108 spires on Angkor Wat. Well, now we can go to nature and we'll find that if you take the diameter of the sun, 864,000 miles, times 108 gives you the distance from the sun to the earth. Go to the moon, which is 2,160 miles. 108 times its diameter is the distance from the earth to the moon. So there's an example of how these ratios, these numbers, are actually embedded in the structure of the solar system. Now, I didn't...
Now, wait a second. So there's no way, of course, that an ancient culture, and I'm part of a modern culture, and I didn't know that, and there's no way they could have known that.
Well, this is the assumption, but I don't know. Here's the thing.
Well, that's right. We don't know.
We don't know.
Thank you.
See, so I'm trying to say, okay, let's just take a time out. Consider that there might be a whole lot more to the ancient history than conventional academia has recognized. And keep this in mind, Tucker. You might already know this. I mean, if you look at our history, recorded written history, 5,000 years. If we look at the current round of history, you go back 10,000 years. You look at the domestication of animals, the transition to sedentary lifestyles.
Yes.
You look at the dispersion of languages, all of these kinds of things 10,000 years ago, right? But humans, modern, like ourselves, have been around for 180, 200,000 years at least. Modern skeletons of humans that are indistinguishable from
People you'd recognize.
Yeah, if you dressed them up in a, put some skin and meat on them and put them in a nice suit, yeah. So here's the question that I've always had when I began to learn that, when I was looking more into anthropology, it was like, okay, well, so wait a minute, we've gone from feudalism
He does look
to
like
the
me, but
space
I'm
age
smarter
in
than
a few
him.
hundred years.
Yeah.
When my two grandfathers were born, I think what the fastest a human had ever traveled at that time was probably by horseback, unless they've been shot out of a cannon or
Right.
something, But and that was the main mode of transportation: on foot, horseback, carriage, right? When my grandparents were born in the 1890s, so think about that: a century and a half. What we've gone to now. Imagine 10,000 years in the future. How easily could a couple of centuries of progress get lost in the noise? Be pretty easy.
In the chaos that humans inevitably create.
Or that nature's created because we aren't paying attention to the.
No, that's right.
And that's kind of what I was about to talk about. If you want to go there.
Yeah, I do, but I don't want to lie to over the significance of what you said about geometry and numbers, because so one of the problems for normal non-science people like me was the 1995 Million Man March on Washington by Louis Farrakhan, which he went into, I covered, and he went into this now famous speech about numerology, and everyone's like, Louis Farrakhan's crazy, therefore there's no significance to number patterns at all because he's crazy, he discredited it. But I remember thinking at the time, yeah, okay, whatever, he's crazy, I get it, but maybe, like, what is he talking about exactly? I mean, people have been fixated on number patterns, on certain numbers above other numbers for thousands of years. Why do you think that is?
Well, I remember when I was on one of the Joe Rogan podcasts with Graham Hancock, and we had this debate with skeptic Michael Shermer, who writes a column for Scientific American. I remember him saying that, well, it's pattern recognition. People are seeing patterns. His take was, well, those patterns aren't really there. They're projecting these patterns. I agreed with him. I said, I think they're seeing patterns, but the patterns are there. And it could be, there's an internal component. Maybe somehow these patterns are structures of our own consciousness.
Right.
But they're most definitely objectively, verifiably provable to exist within the natural order of things. All you got to do is stop and look without preconceptions, and you'll see that it's there.
But how would we know that, or how? Right? I mean, it suggests a connection between people and the natural world that we don't consciously perceive.
Right, and here we come down. Is it something from the inherent within the common conscious field of human beings, or is it diffusionist? Was there somebody who had this kind of information, this knowledge that brought it to these people? If you take a lot of the legends and myths at face value, that's what it's suggesting. I think it could be a combination of both, because the myths are pretty explicit on, there was this group of outsiders that came in and taught us about geometry and astronomy, and then we begin to incorporate it into our culture, and they perhaps left a kind of a template. Which brings us to the whole question that I'm trying to raise, is it possible that there's more to the human story on Earth than conventional scholarship has at this point recognized?
Well, we didn't know dinosaurs existed not that long ago, so that's like a fairly new discovery, right? So, of course, there's a lot we don't know, right?
Yeah.
So what are the markers, as someone who's interested in anthropology and archaeology, would you say, for human civilization that predates the recorded history that we have, that are like kind of anomalous? It doesn't really sort of make sense. Like, the pyramids are clearly one. Are there others where you think, what is that?
Well, here's the problem. What has not been recognized until now is the magnitude of some of the changes that have unfolded on this planet of ours in the time that we humans have been here.
Do you mean physical changes?
Physical changes.
Yes.
Yes. Catastrophic changes.
Yes.
Things that could have easily erased whatever was already there. Whatever was changes, let me put it to you this way: changes on a scale that if they were to happen today, an archaeologist 10,000 years from now would find very little trace of us even having been here. I mean, changes that are on that scale.
The glacial period, the ice ages have.
Yeah, you've had since the time that modern humans, and we don't know how far back they go. I mean, I used to say 150,000 years, and then there were new discoveries put it back to 180,000. Now there's been more discoveries suggesting 200,000. I don't know what the limit's going to be. Like Graham Hancock says, things keep getting older and older. But within that time, there has been a whole succession of glacial, interglacial oscillations. Those shifts are quite dramatic.
Can you tell us what that means? Glacial, interglacial oscillation.
Okay, that would be a good segue into our first slide.
Okay.
Can we look at our first slide? So there's Ice Age Earth. Now that's what the Earth would have looked like 15 to 20,000 years ago. What you've got to do is consider that northwestern Europe, mantle in ice, Northern America, mantle in ice up to 1.5 miles thick, reached from the Atlantic to the Pacific. All of Canada was buried under ice.
Still is.
No, Canada's not there now.
Just kidding.
Well,
I like to mock
intellectually, perhaps some of the yeah. But, no, you had me. What? Okay.
Sorry.
No, Tech Tucker. It's not still buried.
So there's no human civilization in Western Europe or.
Well, that becomes the question. Would there have been civilization in, say, unglaciated? Certainly wasn't any civilization in the area of the glaciation. Now, when you have a cycle of glaciation coming, it pretty much obliterates everything that was there before. The climate changes associated with the transition into an ice age and out of an ice age are almost inconceivably extreme. They really, I mean, you're talking about at the end of the ice age. You know, this was something that used to be conceived as taking 100,000 years. Well, as our dating improved, it went from 100,000 to 50,000, from 50,000 to 20,000. Radiocarbon dating, you know, became a thing in the 1950s. And as we began to learn more, we started finding out, well, wait a minute, there were forests growing in Canada 40 to 50,000 years ago. How's that possible? Well, if there was, you know, 1 mile of ice over Canada. What happened is the span of time between these events just kept contracting and contracting. Then in the 1980s, 1990s, we began to extract high resolution ice cores from Greenland, from Antarctica, from mountain glaciers. The story they told was of climate change that occurred inconceivably fast, where you might have had 10 to 12 degrees centigrade, which is close to like 18 degrees Fahrenheit, literally in less than 5 years. Now, this is very demonstrative.
Ooh, really?
Oh, yeah. I wish, you know, if we had 4 or 5 hours, Tucker, to go, I would have brought a whole lot more material to show you this, you know. But, yeah, I'm not exaggerating. These are...
if that happened now, you would have a lot of dead people.
We're screwed, yeah. If that happened now, yeah. So what you had, there's this period called, you might have heard of it, the Younger Dryas. It was this episode that brought the Ice Age to an end. Now, because of astronomical forces, the Earth, its tilt, the shape of its orbit, and so on, its distance from the sun, there are gradually accumulating changes in the amount of thermal energy reaching the surface of the Earth. These are called the Milankovitch forces. Okay, so generally the thought was that these Milankovitch forces were behind the period of glaciation and deglaciation. The problem is they play out over tens of thousands of years. We're looking at episodes now that happened within a few thousand years, because if you go back to that slide we were just looking at, 13,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, you had an enormous mass of ice. And a few thousand years later, it's gone. Now, in order to get rid of that ice, it requires energy. You don't melt 6 million cubic miles of ice without some source of energy to do the work. And that's the conundrum. And it was first identified in the early 1970s, once they had radiocarbon dating in hand and they saw how fast the disappearance of the ice was. They're scratching their heads and go, wait a second, how could it, 5,000 to 6,000 years? We thought it was 100,000 years. But now radiocarbon dating is showing us that it happened 1/10 or 20th of the time. How do you explain that? They called it the energy paradox, because in 73, 74, there were several conferences held, several papers written in which they identified the energy paradox, and they couldn't come up with an answer. They said there's a mistake in the data somewhere, or in the modeling, we're going to put it on the shelf and we'll get back to it. They've never really gotten back to it. The point is that this energy had to have come from somewhere. So what are the
Wait,
possibilities?
so the energy that melted these miles of glacial ice that covered a lot of the Earth's surface, we don't know that happened. It wasn't just because it got sunnier out.
No, unless the sun was involved on some level exponentially beyond anything we've experienced.
Right, that it's not now.
Right.
But it wasn't just like we had a hot August one year.
No.
No. Okay.
No. But what has happened in the interim is now, in 2007, there was a paper published that has ignited a firestorm of controversy about what happened to the great megafauna. These great, because at the time all of this was going on, when those ice sheets were over North America, you had this tremendous megafauna in the world. You had the mammoths, and you had the giant cave bears. You had the Irish elk with 10 and 12-foot antler spans. You had sloths the size of elephants. You had lions the size of horses. You had dire wolves. I mean, the list went on and on and on. And with a geological eye blink, they were gone. To put that in perspective, the number of species of megafauna that disappeared within this period of deglaciation, 11 to 13.
Deglaciation.
With the ice has disappeared.
During the melting.
During the melting. Yeah, exactly. You got it. During the melting. Over 100 species disappeared worldwide.
Of big animals.
Of big animals. Megafauna is defined as an animal that's more than 44 kilograms or 100 pounds roughly in body weight. So we're all mega mammals, right? But the ones today, the lions and tigers and bears and everything else, deer and antelope and whatever, go ahead, make the whole list. About 110 to 120 species right in there, depending on how you divide it up. That was about the number of species that went extinct during this episode of deglaciation. Now, think about that.
Like every big mammal on Earth just goes extinct.
Well, half of all the big, because the other half are the ones that are on the planet today. The giant American bison was 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Now, I don't know if you've ever been out in a herd of bison.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're impressive beasts.
Yeah.
Now imagine a bison that's twice the body mass. So, it seemed to selectively affect really large animals. And that makes sense because if you have a tremendous amount of habitat destruction, what that means is it's going to affect the food supply. The larger animals that require more food, that have a longer gestation period of animals of young in the womb, that have a longer period of time of requirement of nurturing until they're viably independent. All of that is longer. So if you have habitat destruction, it's going to selectively go to the top of the food chain. Whereas the smaller animals, the scavengers, these things, they're going to have a field day because there's going to be a lot of carrion that they're going to be able to eat. And we know, like, that in place, you may have heard, about woolly mammoths that have been found quick frozen, flash frozen,
Yes.
in permafrost,
Yeah.
which is still a mystery.
What does that mean? Why?
Because nobody, how do you explain? Well, Clarence Birdseye, who was the inventor of the fast flash freezing of food,
Yes.
right? Birdseye Foods. He was commissioned to do a study. He looked at it and said, well, wait a second, we're looking at, like in the Beresovka mammoth that was discovered in 1901 with some of the warming that came out of the Little Ice Age. There was a bank of permafrost up on the Beresovka River in Siberia that collapsed, exposed this woolly mammoth that had been frozen. Now, in this mammoth's mouth is flowering plants that it had been eating, right? The mammoth was sitting on his haunches with both back hips broken, right? There was something like 20 different varieties of plants and sedges and things in the stomach that was undigested, right? So what he looked at is said, how quickly, and the whole mammoth, I mean, it still had marbled flesh. The skin was intact. I mean, I've got pictures of it that were taken in my slideshows and stuff. I didn't bring them here today, but you had, so he looked at it and he said, well, the contents of the stomach is not even putrefied. The entire content, even the cells of the mammoth are frozen. So how fast would it take a 6-ton mammoth to freeze that the contents of the stomach would not even putrefy? And I think what he came up with, if I remember, it's been a while since I've read the studies, like 10 hours. So if you're going to freeze a woolly mammoth, 6 tons of body mass in 10 hours, what kind of temperature change does that require? Well, so the animal is eating flowering plants. And literally, it appears that moments later, he's slammed onto his haunches. His penis was erect within the permafrost, which is a sign that he was rapidly suffocated. So he slammed to his haunches, presumably buried.
Is that a symptom of rapid suffocation?
Yes, yes, under pressure, great deal of pressure. So he was buried instantly and then frozen, and that's where he's been for thousands of years until the planet warmed a bit in early 1900s, and this bank of permafrost collapsed, exposed the mammoth's head, and it was a whole year later before scientists had gotten there to study this carcass, and by that time wolves had devoured the flesh off of the skull, but they were able to exhume and, I guess, preserve it to some extent in the Leningrad Museum, and there's photographs of it, just how it was found. So that's, it's those kind of mysteries that really.
So what is I mean, what's your guess on that?
Tucker, I have pondered this literally for decades, and I don't have an answer. But I think we might be approaching a possibility of excuse me, of an explanation.
And to be clear, this is not the only woolly mammoth found in permafrost.
No, woolly rhinos have been found. Yeah, lots of creatures. Now, if you come over into Alaska, there's frozen permafrost that has the remains of thousands of mega mammals in it. They're not intact, though. They're completely disarticulated, and they're mixed in with this. Now, you've just been through a major storm here, so you've had a taste of catastrophic weather events, right? You've seen trees knocked down.
Sure.
Now, in this permafrost in Alaska, and there's been some relatively recent studies on that, there's found the remains of trees that have been uprooted and torn apart, and mingled in with those trees by the thousands are disarticulated animal remains. What else is interesting? Frozen, yeah, right. But now it's not frozen intact. I mean, this is like animals that have been literally ripped apart. Disarticulated is a fancy word for saying ripped apart, right? Mingled in with that, interestingly, are microspherules, iridium nanodiamonds, the signatures of some kind of an impact of something from space, mingled into that permafrost. In this study, which 4 or 5 years ago, so I know some of the people that were involved in that study. I didn't come prepared really to talk about that in detail. Maybe we could pick that up in another discussion, but it looks like there was some type of a cosmic impact event. This is the thing that this 2007 paper that I mentioned earlier that was so controversial, where they proposed that the extinction of the megafauna was due to some kind of a cosmic impact event. And now this theory has evolved. It met with a firestorm of criticism.
Why?
Why was it criticized?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, a number of reasons. Okay, I think that gets us right back to politics, right? Because right now, the narrative is that any kind of catastrophic change involving our planet is our fault. We're doing it by burning fossil fuel, whatever.
Yes.
Okay, right? Also, maybe like Extinction Rebellion. You've heard we're going to cause the 6th great mass extinction, and the previous 5, would include the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary of 66 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs. It would include the end Devonian, the Jurassic extinction, the late Permian, where 95% of all species on Earth went extinct. These are obviously natural events because they happened long before human beings were here, right? It appears that they're a result of a combination of 2 forces: extraterrestrial, which we would call exogenic from the outside, and perhaps volcanic and seismic, which would be endogenic from the inside of the planet. I think there's a whole line of research now that links the two, that sometimes great impacts on Earth might, as a response, trigger intense volcanism. Now, so what you have is a double whammy there. You have the sulfur dioxides and the poisons extruded from volcanoes erupting. You also have all of the things brought in by what, you've heard the term nuclear winter?
Yes.
Cosmic winter was the actually original term in the aftermath of the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary event, which was the dinosaur killer.
The dust blocked the sun.
The dust and soot from the fires and everything blocked the sun, right? Well, now it appears that this similar, not on the same scale or magnitude, but a similar type of event happened around 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. And this was connected with the sudden demise of the megafauna, the rapid and sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America, huge spikes of climate change, warming, cooling that happened repeatedly, like the climate of the planet just went spastic for a couple of thousand years. This is what's called the Younger Dryas. Younger Dryas, there was an older Dryas. From the older Dryas to the Younger Dryas.
What period was that?
This would last from roughly 14,500 years ago to about 11,500, about a 3,000 year period. I don't think that the extinction of the megafauna was one fell swoop. I think it was a series of blows that finally brought these great creatures to an end, brought the planet out of the ice age, and basically opened the door onto the modern epoch in which our own civilization.
But we know that human beings lived,
yes,
throughout all of this.
But we're also finding out that it appears that there was a major depopulation event associated with that time period. This is cutting edge new research, but it really looks like the human population crashed. And you basically had groups that survived but were dispersed around the planet, which has obscured the genetic signal, right? Because if it was just one single isolated group, there would be a strong genetic signal. There's not a strong genetic signal, which would suggest, but what we see is that places like the Clovis, there was 50 Clovis sites at least in unglaciated North America. Most of them were suddenly abandoned. Quarries where they had been pulling out the chert and their stones that they were using for their tools and everything. You had campsites with the middens, the shell piles and stuff that was the refuge. Almost as if overnight, a majority of them were abandoned. And the old assumption, one by one.
At the same period?
At the same, not only at the same period, but almost within the same day as the dating is honing in on when these sites disappeared. Now, the old idea was, oh, well, these guys picked up and moved somewhere else. Problem is you go somewhere else and it looks like the same thing happened. So, yeah. So now what's apparent is that, yeah, it's not that they picked up and moved. They were essentially exterminated in these events that wiped out half the megafauna. So what kind of events are we talking about? That's the thing that I came here. I wanted to show you a few things because all over the globe, now that we know how to look for it, we can see the signs of this trauma.
Can I ask you a philosophical question?
Absolutely.
Just because you're blowing my mind.
Good.
But I almost never hear anybody talk like this, and what I hear instead is people telling me that they know how everything happened, and they have no questions, they only have answers. And there's a kind of certainty, or absolute, almost religious certainty, that enters into all explanations of the past and future. And what you're saying is a lot of stuff we don't understand. Why don't I hear that more?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a lot of mystery about the story of
As there would be, but what I mean by that, how a lot of stuff's unknowable, obviously.
Yeah.
Why don't I hear people who call themselves scientists speak with that kind of reverence for the limits of their knowledge?
Okay, I think one thought is this. In the early days of the scientific study of the Earth, going back to the 1820s, 1830s, up to the post-Civil War time, these were mostly gentlemen scientists, doctors, preachers.
Yeah, a lot of clergymen, actually.
A lot of clergymen. Yeah, exactly. Right? Now, these guys are going out, looking at landscapes without preconceptions.
Yes.
Over and over, you could do a list of from William Buckland to Georges Cuvier to Adam Sedgwick to Roderick Murchison. The list goes on. They were all catastrophists. Their interpretation of the landscape was that really some big events happened in the past, right? Well, what happened
That's my interpretation. I'm an outdoorsman, so I'm outside every day, and that is definitely my interpretation just from looking at the landscape.
You got it. Okay. So then what happened? You had James Hutton, William Playfair, and Charles Lyell, who came along. who established the creed of uniformitarianism, gradualism. The idea here, and it's a very useful working hypothesis for looking and understanding ancient global change. Basically, it says that the present is the key to the past. So you look at processes that are going on today. A river is eroding its banks.
Right.
A glacier moves over the landscape and creates glacial till and terminal mooring. Right. So you see this glacier. You know, I mentioned the Little Ice Age. Well, the Little Ice Age was the coldest period since the entire Holocene began. About 12. Actually, the date of the Holocene, which is our current geological epoch, is put precisely at about 11,600 years ago. And that was the transition from the previous epoch, the Pleistocene, which lasted for 2.5 million years, into a completely different epoch, the one that we're in now, that saw, again, the rise of farming, agriculture, all of this, the dispersion of languages, like I mentioned, and then ultimately led to the rise of our own civilization after multiple aborted attempts. We've now gotten to a level unprecedented throughout the Holocene, right? So the uniformitarianists or the gradualists, they won today. And they were involved in establishing the academic institutions at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century that pretty much established the creeds and the the dogmas that were going to be taught. So they said, yes, you can look at these forces at work today and extrapolate backwards from that to understand everything that happened. Well, like I said, it's a powerful working methodology, no doubt, but it's only half the equation. The other half of the equation that was thrown out, the baby thrown out with the bathwater, is what the early guys were looking at: catastrophes, seeing evidence in the landscape that they said, looks like it was, how do you interpret this other than some gigantic flood?
Yeah.
Well, then the graduals said, oh, you're trying to get us back to biblical literalism. Get out of here. We don't want to hear any of that. So by the early 20th century, what had happened is the gradualist dogma became entrenched in academia. And then there's the famous story of J. Harlan Bretz in the 1920s, who documented this evidence up in the Pacific Northwest for these tremendously giant floods. And they said, you're crazy. Get out of here. We don't want to hear any of that. It took 30 years before geologists finally actually began to look at the evidence he'd been doggedly accumulating.
Yes.
Right? When they finally started taking a look at it, they had to go, you know what? There is no other way to interpret
like
this.
flooding Idaho, right? Like big floods.
Big floods.
Yeah.
You want to see some of that?
Sure.
Let's look at the next slide here, and we'll go through a few things.
That would be the Pacific Ocean going back to the Rockies, kind of thing.
That's much earlier.
Oh.
When we get to slide number 2, I'm going to show you, this is where I had my initial epiphany. And I'm going to show you, it's called an underfit river is the geological term. An underfit river, here we go. So if you look at this, let's see, we don't have a pointer, do we?
No.
Okay, what I'm going to try to show you here is, you can see in 1969, I'm just a punk out of high school, and I'm standing on, you can see if you look at it, there's a huge channel there, right? You can see there's an embankment on the south, an embankment on the north. It's 3 miles wide.
Mm-hmm.
The modern Minnesota River is that little blue curly thing on the floor of that.
Yeah.
I was standing, I went out here one day, was on an outing, and I was standing on a 250-foot high bluff on the northern rim, looking down into this huge awning valley and seeing the Minnesota River down there. And I looked across and I could see these embankments matching the ones that I was standing on over miles away in the distance. And I just remember looking back and forth between the little river that was, I could see down below me, and it had embankments on it. And those embankments were like miniature versions of that big thing there. And I remember thinking, is it possible this whole thing was filled with water? Nah, get out of here. And I just didn't think there was even anything that I could ever even grasp or get my head around. I forgot about it. A decade goes by. In the interim, it's been started studying geology more. I was also very interested in mythology. So I was reading stories from, ancient cultures, mythology. One of the themes over and over and over again in all of these ancient stories was these ideas of these great catastrophes that engulfed the earth, destroyed the earth. We all know the biblical story of Noah's flood, but we begin to see, I begin to, see the Greek tales of Deucalion, who survived a flood, Utnapishtim, who survived a flood, Manu in India, who survived a great flood, and the Hopi Indians had tales about gigantic floods. And
I'm sensing a theme here.
Yeah, well, all over the planet, you've got these cultural groups that have these stories about these giant floods.
And they're not texting each other, these stories.
Presumably not. They're not. No, they're not on Twitter texting each other, as far as we know. So, anyways, I'm looking at that, and then a year later, I'm traveling out. I spent the whole 4 months just hiking, and back in those days we could hitchhike.
Yeah,
I hitchhiked a lot. I rode with friends sometimes, traveling over most of the western states, and everywhere I went, I just got this impression that I couldn't shake, that there's a story here that goes beyond just all these landscapes were created one grain of sand and one drop of water at a time. And I remember one of the really insightful experiences I had was going through the Columbia River Gorge.
Yeah.
That forms the border between Washington,
Oregon and Washington. Yeah.
And looking at those landscapes and the magnitude of the gorge there, it just struck me. So years later, not 6, 7, 8 years later, I started going, okay, I'm going to read some actual geology. I started reading geology textbooks. A few years later, I enrolled in school and started taking geology courses, just to get my head wrapped around what are the geologists saying about this? So the more I got into it, the more I realized, there seems to be dogmas that don't really recognize. Now, at this time, by the time we get to the end of the 1960s and into the 70s, mainstream geology had accepted the reality of these giant floods up in the Pacific Northwest. However, they contrived an explanation where they were trying to force fit it into the gradualist model, which we know from glaciers, when they melt, they form lakes in front of the glaciers.
Yeah.
Proglacial lakes, right? We know that glaciers can form temporary dams, and it will allow this meltwater to fill up, and at some point the pressure exceeds the ability of the glacier to retain it. And particularly Iceland is prone to this, where there's volcanoes that will erupt under the ice sheet. It'll create a reservoir of meltwater, and typically 2 to 3 weeks later, that meltwater will have percolated through the ice. It will discharge at the snout of the glacier in a Icelandic term is Jökulás, which is a catastrophic flood. I began to look at some of the estimates. There was a hydrologist by the name of paleohydrologist by the name of Victor Baker who published a study in 1973 where he was up in a valley just northeast of the city of Spokane, Washington. He was able to look at the slope of the valley, the width of the valley. He found high water marks on the valley. So engineers use this Chesi formula, it's called, and it basically tells you what peak discharge is. And it's based upon primarily the gradient. The faster, the steeper the gradient, the faster the water's moving. The channel geometry, which can be determined by where the high water marks are, right? Then they introduce a coefficient of roughness, because of a smooth channel will have one kind of flow. If you introduce, it'll introduce turbulence. He did this formula, it's called the step backwater method. He calculated that the flow, peak discharge through there, was as much as 800 million cubic feet per second. How do you even wrap your head around what that is?
It's, too much for trout fishing.
Yeah, too much for whitewater rafting.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's enough to completely transform a landscape.
Oh, completely. And the estimates are, if you took every single river on Earth, every continent, think of all the great rivers, North America, South America,
I've been on a lot of
Africa, yeah. Imagine you take every river on Earth flowing together all at once. You'd still have to go 10 to 20 times more than that to get this flow that came through the Spokane Valley. Yeah. So how do you explain that? Well, I don't think, the more I looked at the conventional...
That's like God's fire hose right there. I mean,
That's like God's fire hose. Yeah. You want to see some more?
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide, Emily.
Do you teach geology?
I've given lectures to geologists, so yeah. I've taken geologists out in the field to show them.
Can I just ask you one more philosophical question? Why don't they form their theories on the basis of observation more?
This is happening more. Yes, it is.
Because it seems like theories based on theories, which is like not a good way. It's like making photographs from photographs. It's like, don't take a new photograph.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. You lose information every time.
Exactly. Like, why don't you just look at stuff?
Well, yeah. Now this slide we just pulled up here, this is an example. I could show you dozens. Again, these are underfit rivers, where the modern rivers, on the left is the Missouri River, on the right is the Chicago River. It doesn't matter. Left is the Missouri River. The right, forgot which river that is. I made this slide quite some time ago. Anyways, you'll notice the channels with the flat floors,
yes,
are much bigger than the rivers.
I have seen that many times in river valleys. Many times.
Yeah.
Like the one I fish in is like that. It's a huge channel, but there's just a.
There is an example, Tucker, of what the geologists call an underfit stream or underfit river. In other words, here's the thing: the channels that they're flowing in were created by mega floods. And it would be natural that the modern river is going to flow in these oversized channels.
Of course.
And once it's in there, it can't really get out.
Of course, that's right.
Right, it's trapped.
It's a river valley. You can't go
anywhere. It's a river valley.
Yeah.
And what is the modern floodplain of the river really is the flat floor of the ancient gigantic river channel. And that's meltwater. That's all meltwater there that created that. And so these meltwater floods were enormous, and they're showing up anywhere where there were glaciers. Let's go to the next slide, Emily. We'll have a look here. See what we got. Okay, here's an aerial shot I did of an underfit river.
It's a snake.
That's a snake.
Where is that?
Well, that is it's to the west of Pocatello.
Yeah.
Pocatello.
Man, I fished right in there.
Have you really?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've hiked all over in there. I didn't do any fishing.
Oh, great trout fishing.
Oh, I bet. I got
cut throats.
I did that when I was a kid, and I've said over and over, I want to get back into that.
You need to.
I know.
Important.
Yeah, I think it is. Because I could be fishing, and I could also be thinking about.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, so okay. If you go back to that, let's see what do we got here. This is So what I've got. It's difficult to read here. Okay, so the average discharge 56,000 cubic.
So it was 195 CFS was the record.
Cubic feet per,
74,
yes.
Yeah.
The Bonneville flood that created that channel was 40 million cubic feet per second. 40 million. Now, if we go back to that first slide I showed you when I was just a punk looking out into that valley, I remember getting into an argument with a friend of mine years later who had a degree in geology. And he said, and I was talking about how I thought that this maybe had been formed by this gigantic flood. He said, no, that had been formed over millions of years. And I said, no, I think you're wrong, John. I think you're wrong on this. And in fact, it was that argument I had with him that was one of the things that motivated me to enroll. You know, I'd taken engineering courses and drawing courses connected with my building and stuff. I had never taken a geology course. So I went in and I took a couple of years of geology. And I did quite well academically in there. But I was motivated because I was convinced that, no, I think it was a big flood. Now, since then, studies have come out and they say this was glacial, they called the glacial river Warren. Using the same formula, the estimate of the volume of glacial river Warren was 4,000 times greater than that of the modern Minnesota River. And I've never run across my friend John again to gloat over him to,
Well, it's so obvious.
Yeah.
Now that you explain it this way. So all of this adds, just to circle back to the pyramids, I think you're answering by implication the question, which is, would it be possible for civilizations we consider ancient that actually aren't that ancient in the scope of human existence, really? They're pretty modern, relatively speaking, but whatever. For them to have had knowledge far superior to what we assumed they had, because if human civilization is just this continuum, then it would be impossible.
It is an exponential curve, and we're up here, and everything here was barbarism, savagery,
exactly
illiteracy.
But you're describing events that not only change the landscape, but that, of course, would change human populations.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
absolutely.
So it's entirely possible that you could have had quite advanced civilizations that were eliminated by these events.
And here's the thing, when the critics pounce on this idea, they're always looking at this possibility through the lens that they would be looking for a civilization that was a mere reflection of our own.
Right, exactly.
And this is the work of interesting Malcolm Bendel, is that he's showing that there could have been technological capabilities that would have yielded a civilization that wouldn't have looked anything like our own, that could have looked completely different. And this is something maybe we could resume that conversation.
But that would have been technologically advanced in a way that we would recognize as advanced.
Possibly, potentially, yes. But, you know, we're not going to be looking for, you know, jet fighters and cars and skyscrapers and things like that.
Well, one way to measure it would be the endurance of the things left behind from that civilization. So there's nothing that has been created by our civilization that will exist in 3,000 years.
That's right.
The building materials are that, right? So like rebar and concrete degrade fairly quickly. They're not going to last 3,000 years. There's no skyscraper that will be here in 300 years.
Yeah. Concrete would degrade quickly.
Right, I know.
Yeah.
So like, we've never built a Great Pyramid, actually.
No. Well, we couldn't. We couldn't. And, you know,
I never thought of this before.
To think that subsistence farmers or you know, nomadic tribes could have taken time off from their wanderings to build a pyramid or to me it's ludicrous. It's so stark in your face that there's more to this than the conventional models are willing to admit. And one of the things that has fascinated me for years and years is the extent of what was going on in North America before the Europeans arrived. And all over particularly the eastern side of the continent, there were these tremendous monumental earthworks of vast extent that would have required hundreds of thousands of hours of labor. You know, and the conventional model is that, there was all antler picks and wicker baskets. Yet, if you look at Cahokia or Emerald Mound in Mississippi.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of these things?
Oh, well, let's see. So there was what was called the Portsmouth Works, which was southern Ohio. It was 5 miles in length.
5 miles?
5 miles. Yes, 5 miles.
So
It was raised embankments, concentric circles, geometric earthworks in a complex that was 5 miles long.
GM's biggest manufacturing plant is not 5 miles long.
No.
No.
No. And again, I've got drone footage, I've got slides, everything.
5 miles?
5 miles.
So what do
Most of
archaeologists?
it's gone now.
Why?
Well, because urban agriculture, railroad building.
What do archaeologists imagine was there? Like, why 5 miles of earthworks?
Yeah, 5 miles of earthworks. Well, I don't know. I mean, what we have is the surveys that were done by Squire and Davis and others back 150 years ago, 160, 70 years ago. They're kind of forgotten. I mean, you know.
Wait, what kind of population would you need to support something? Like, why would you ever need to build a human structure 5 miles long?
Well, yeah. Why would you?
No, I'm serious. It's like kind of an obvious question.
Well, see, that's kind of, you know, where I'm really, see, this is the thing I'm trying to say is we don't have all the answers yet. Listen, all you young people out there that think it's all figured out, it ain't. It's not figured out. There's a whole lot of questions.
So this is the downside. There are many of Google. It gives the impression of like a totality of knowledge of every answer existing. But but just to stick to what we know. We know there is a human-built structure 5 miles long.
Yes.
In North America.
Oh yeah, it was extensively surveyed and documented in the mid-19th
Okay, so that right there, if that's all we know, let's just say that's the only fact we have before us.
No
That
need to
like
worry, guys.
completely
We
overturns
all
our
know there
understanding
are
of
no
what
real
we think
guys
was
in
going
here.
on here.
Duh.
Yeah.
You know, duh.
Hey, Chad.
What can I say? And that was just
Here you
one.
go.
I mean, there was a gigantic system of these monumental earthworks all over. I mean, from Georgia up to Pennsylvania, west to the Mississippi, Cahokia. Look up Cahokia, and you have a gigantic flat-topped mound, which I believe I've been up on the top of it, and you look, and it's interesting. I mean, it's now about, I think, 75 feet high. It's eroded down. It's probably originally the height of a 9-story building, 3 times the length of a football field. Think about that. It's huge. You go up on top and it's flat, and what that does is it gives you a 360-degree view of the horizon in every direction. And when I was up there looking up there, that's what struck me, is that this is what they were doing. They were creating a platform to watch the movement of the heavens.
But using the technology that we assume the people who built this had, and of course we have no freaking idea what technology they had, but we pretend that we know, and earth picks and wicker baskets, as you put it,
Yeah.
as
Antler
antler
picks, yeah.
picks. So like there's no, that, with the population we imagine lived here, extrapolating backward from the Indian nations who were here when we arrived.
Yeah.
That's just not possible.
Right.
So like it had to have looked much different from what we imagined.
Yeah, to me, it's an unresolved mystery. And here's the thing, which is not really politically correct to say anymore, but if you read all the old accounts of the surveyors, the pioneers, the people who talked to the tribes that were living amongst the remains of these giant earthworks, it was invariably the same thing. They didn't build them, someone before them
Yes,
built
well,
them.
that's right.
That they,
Well, there's archaeological evidence of that was suppressed by the tribes. I mean, there has been, like, there's skeletal evidence of
Yeah.
people who bear no genetic resemblance to the current Indians. So, like, there was another group here.
Kennewick Man.
Thank
Perfect
you.
example. Yeah. And see, so what they did a lot, there was many cases of intrusive burials. So here's this Indian mound. They obviously thought it was sacred. Some royal personage dies. They bury that person up on the Indian
Weird guy
mound.
is wanting
Archaeologists
another
come back later,
honorary
dig up
timeout.
that remains,
Period.
radiocarbon date it,
I'll
and
give
go,
you
okay,
the
this is
honor.
from 1500. So then they assume that that's when the mound was built, but not necessarily, because there's a lot of evidence that these burials were in fact intrusive. They weren't contemporary with the erection of the mound.
No, this is someone using the wreckage of somebody else's civilization as a burial site.
Yes.
So, is there any archaeological evidence so far that suggests who built this and why?
No, but one of the interesting things, and this is very controversial idea, and I kind of stay away from it a little bit only because there's been a lot of really fringe speculation around it.
Yeah.
But it's well documented, and I've gone back in, where I live in Georgia, I've got access to Emory University, and they've got extensive archives of manuscripts and stuff going back to the 1700s, 1800s. I've paid money to be able to access, to get a library card to access some of this stuff. So I've got copies, like the historical records of a county in Ohio, for example, from 1840 or 1860, whatever, right? I got all kinds of this stuff. And one of the interesting things over and over again that you find is that they're doing an excavation and they dig up skeletons that are 7 and 8 feet long. Like there's right outside, just north of Atlanta, where I live, there's a called Etowah Mound. Huge complex of mounds. It's got an orientation to the summer solstice sunrise. Same orientation as Stonehenge, for example. And in the early part of the 20th century, they did their first excavations of that. Well, if you go into the little local museum, it has all photographs and everything of the people doing the excavation, line by line account of what they discovered and all of this. But if you go back to the original papers that were which I've done, you go back to the original papers from the early 20th century, they talk about excavating a skeleton that was well over 7 feet, maybe 7 foot 6 inches tall. Yet in the modern museum, there's not one single mention of the fact that they dug up this huge skeleton.
What happened to the skeleton?
I don't know. So now that's when we get into the conspiracy theory.
Well, I mean, that, the existence of a huge people is like a recurring theme in biblical literature. As
Yes.
you know, of course, there's a name for them and everything, and I can't comment on that, but certainly that's been posited before,
And it's not just the Bible.
I'm sure.
I mean,
Digging
Native
graves
Americans have
stuck in the
traditions of-
permafrost.
They say
Make them
that
work.
there was a contingent of Delaware Indians that visited Thomas Jefferson when he was governor of Virginia, and he's relayed this account in his notes on Virginia, and he's talking about how these Indians came in, and back at the time, they had found extensive deposits of mastodons. And if you look at a mastodon jaw and a skull, it looks monstrous.
Yeah.
You know, you'd think that, you know, a mastodon was a browser. So they ate tree branches, right? Which meant they had these huge, sharp molars. And I mean, you look at a mastodon skeleton, look pretty ferocious, right? Well, in Jefferson's time, they didn't know that mastodons were extinct. So by way of, I think it was Rogers, it was one of the guys, I don't remember the exact detail, but when Lewis and Clark, yeah, I think it was George Rogers. I think it was when Lewis and Clark were about to head out and embark on their exploratory mission. Jefferson sends by way of I think it was James Rogers Clark. I don't remember exactly who the character was, but secret instructions that if they were in the Western wilderness and they didn't know mastodons, they called it the American Incognitum, right? The unknown, whatever this thing was. So the instructions were, if you encounter one of these things, if possible, capture it and bring it back. I think he wanted to have it, you know, in his garden at the
Private zoo.
Yeah, in his private zoo. Of course, they didn't find one, but there were sites, you know, where there were mass kill sites. I visited quite a number of them, where, you know, the remains of these things were entombed in the muck and the peat deposits and stuff. Yeah.
What do you mean mass kill sites?
Or where you might find a dozen or several dozen remains of different of these animals. Like, not like one animal dies and, well, see, back in the 1980s, when there was these horrible droughts in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of water holes were drying up and thousands of elephants died because of the drought. So they did some of the very first studies, taphonomic studies. Now, taphonomy is the study of what happens to a animal between the time it dies and the time that it becomes a permanent part of the fossil record. So they wanted to try to come to some better understanding of the taphonomic processes involved in the fossilization of elephants. Here was the problem, though. You had whole elephants that succumbed and died at the edges of these water holes, and within 5 years, there was no remains of them left.
Yeah, why would there be?
Right. I mean, the bones decay away, scavengers.
Of course.
Yeah, there was nothing left. Yet, here you have these mass kill sites where one of them is called Big Bone Lick. It's on because there were salt deposits, and they called it the Big Bone Lick because they believed that these mastodons were coming there. Well, animals, even in modern times, would go there to lick these salt deposits.
Yes.
But there were apparently like several dozen remains of these huge mastodons, like when some of the first, like, who was it, Bartram? I don't remember who was it, it'll come to me, but one of the first explorers that went through there, there's these giant rib cages and tusks sticking up out of the peat, right? It was like a elephant graveyard almost. And, you know, that was the thing that elicited the excitement of Jefferson, that, you know, wondering if these creatures still existed somewhere in the Western wilderness. But, you know, you have, so the conventional explanation would be, well, one of them comes in, dies, and then, you know, decades later, another one wanders in, dies in the same place.
Did not know that either.
The dating of it, though,
Very
suggests that
interesting.
it was a mass kill, that they died in mass. And same thing with the Hot Springs site in South Dakota. You know, you've got dozens of mammoths entombed in this clay kind of matrix. And I've been there, tried to engage some of the paleontologists working on there, like, because their model is that, okay, you had a sinkhole and, you know, a mammoth wandered in and got stuck and couldn't get out.
Right.
And then,
Like the La Brea tar pits.
yeah, and then later another one wanders in. And so I said, well, I started asking questions. Well, what kind of dating has been done on the enclosing matrix? I mean, there must be, you know, one of the women that was guiding us in there, one of the paleontologists, she got really annoyed with me for asking these questions. She wouldn't really even address the question of, because I had read a study where he called it, the paleontologist that was looking at it called it, well, this is a little different than the conventional model. He called it the bloat and float. The bloat and float was this, that these mammoths, a herd of mammoths got caught in a huge flood, swept their carcasses along, and then there was a low hollow spot. And, you know, whenever you have a flood, water is gonna accumulate.
Yeah, of course.
So the bloat was the carcasses died, gases they bloated, and then they floated into this, what later became a sinkhole. And of course, that would imply a catastrophic end. And I asked her about this, and she wouldn't even go there. She wouldn't even talk to me about it.
Because people are intentionally incurious. This is one of the most interesting conversations I've had in a long time in memory. If viewers have made it to this point, hour and 10 minutes in, and they want to know more about your research and the questions that you're asking, the evidence that you've gathered, where would they find it?
RandallCarlson.com, howtube.com. I'm partnering with a new internet platform, Howtube.
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 Howtube. Okay.
Howtube. And Malcolm's work is going to be featured there. We're kind of collating our two websites. That's going to happen within the next, it's happening right now, but RandallCarlson.com would be the simplest way to find it. And there will be the links to a lot of other stuff. George Howard's site, The Cosmic Tusk, is a great site for looking at this kind of stuff. In fact, if people are interested actually in a conference that's coming up next June, where we're going to have sort of from the plausible fringe all the way to hard scientists. There'll be about 8 or 10 people participating and presenting. In the Cosmic Summit, it's called, and like 4 of the people presenting are members of the Comet research team that have been looking at evidence for a comet, some type of a cometary impact event associated with this period, Younger Dryas. But we'll be, we'll be putting all of that out there. I've got hours and hours
Thank
of
you guys for
podcasts where I've
hanging
been
out. period.
discussing all of this stuff.
If
And
you
I
find
regularly
something
do
that I'm able to
appearances.
broadcast without.
And I do
getting
tours
the
as well,
channel
where I take
taken
people
down.
out to show. We got
Hit me
5
up
minutes
in
left. Can we just
Discord.
fast
Period.
trip through a few more slides? I want
Yeah,
you-
yeah, let's go through a few more.
Okay, so go to the next. What do we got here? Oh yeah, we're gonna get into, this is some of the things where you have mute evidence of the power of some of these floods. These are called erratic boulders, and these are boulders that were moved by water. I'm not seeing them yet. There we go. Okay. Now, when you look at something like this and you imagine, okay, what kind of a water flow would it be necessary to pluck and transport boulders like this?
I have asked that question of myself. Yes.
There you go. Yeah. See, this is how it starts, Tucker.
Well, I think nature's fascinating, and I think
Yes.
you just shut up and watch it for a minute.
Shut up and watch it.
Yeah.
Just, yeah. Okay, let's go to the next one.
So what's the answer? How'd they get, I mean, that must have taken,
That was the Bonneville that was 40 million cubic feet
Yeah.
per second. Okay, this is an iceberg rafted erratic. It's stranded on a ledge hundreds of feet above the modern Columbia. It was carried along in an iceberg during the Great Meltdown. And you can see the scale of that. It's enormous. Go to the next slide. Okay, that's just a closer in view of it. Okay, look at this. So
Yeah.
when you travel around and you're looking for this stuff, I mean, it's hidden a lot of the time. Like here it is, it's hidden in the forest. You have to hike up to find it. But there
I
it is.
see a lot of this in the woods
Yeah,
in Maine,
Yeah,
heavy glacier area.
Yeah.
And
some erratics are transported by ice. Others, though, are found, like that ice, that rock there was found south of the glacier margin. So it was not transported by ice.
where was the glacier margin in modern America, roughly?
Well, it did this. It most southernmost extent came almost down to the Ohio River that forms the border of Ohio and Kentucky.
Yeah.
It's definitely covered all of Maine, all of New
Oh,
England.
yeah.
Yeah.
And very noticeably, too,
Yeah,
at this
yeah.
point.
Yeah. Out west, it,
Obviously, it
north,
stopped at
north
Hope's
and
house.
South Dakota, most of South Dakota was just south of the ice sheet. But then when you get to the furthest west, the most southerly extension of the ice was where Puget Sound is now.
Yes.
That was occupied by a huge glacier tongue that came ultimately out of the Canadian Rockies. So you had two great ice sheets during the North American ice sheet. The Cordilleran, which was roughly the size of the ice sheet that's now on Greenland, covered the western provinces of Canada and northern United States. And then the Laurentide was the big one. It was about the size or even bigger than the ice cap that now covers the South Pole. And those were the two They started independently, and then before that was done, they had merged, they had coalesced and become a single ice mass, reaching from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Incredible.
I know.
So our guys think Patrol are leaving because they got to do the nightly show.
Yeah.
So we're out of time, but I'm going on RandallCarlson.com
Great.
as soon as I get off the air tonight.
Right.
Your combination of relentless curiosity and willingness to admit what you don't know is in such marked contrast to the science that we see practiced in our public spaces that is just really refreshing
Thanks.
to hear it.
There are implications to this, especially when it comes to the modern climate change controversies.
those are-
We didn't get into that.
No, you don't need to get into it because it's all implied. I think this all the
Yeah.
time. As a hunter and a fisherman who's often outside in places shaped like glaciers,
Yeah.
this has occurred to me 1,000 times. Nobody noticed this?
Yeah. Here we go.
Randall Carlson, thank you. Can't thank you enough.
I can't thank you enough for having me on.
Amazing conversation. Thank you. Chuck Carlson is the name of the show. New episodes 3 days a week on Fox Nation. We'll see you every night, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Catch you later.